Low fiber, high fiber, it really wasn't an issue. It didn't really impact how that translated to their overall health. And from that, we know that in both cases, gut health presumably was really quite well. What he actually did find was that in locations where processed foods were being introduced, the younger generations, especially that at a younger age were having exposure to these refined flour foods, essentially got habituated to them, became addicted to them, incorporated them in larger amounts into their diet. And actually, very quickly, over the course of one generation, he started to observe significant degeneration in the health of that particular younger generation of people.
Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show.
On today's topic, it's a big one. It's one that I encounter all the time with clients, one that I see a lot of really contradictory information around just out there, both in conventional medicine as well as in the functional medicine space. And I thought a lot of you would be really interested in just hearing some perspective on the entire question of fiber. Specifically the recommendation that people struggling with gut issues, often IBS and IBD, will be told to increase their fiber to make their symptoms better. When in fact, in my experience and based on the research I've done personally, I believe the exact opposite to be true. And this is something that I was told as well as a patient many years ago when I was at the beginning of my journey. It comes up all the time. So let's kind of dive into this question of fiber. I'm going to be talking in part to people who are on the path of gut dysfunction, whether you have IBS or IBD or something else, as well as somewhat just the general population of people who don't have gut symptoms, but might just be curious about fiber and some of the advice they've heard over time. So let's start a little bit by defining what fiber is, just to be absolutely clear, and also which foods generally contain more fiber so that we're totally on the same page. So fiber is essentially a component of certain foods that is essentially a waste product that the body can't really break down and absorb like it can other components of the food, but will essentially end up making its way down to the colon where the majority of our gut microbiome and bacteria live, and then become fermentation or a food source in a sense for those bacteria. And it's actually through this fermentation process that the production of what are called short chain fatty acids occurs, as well as some vitamin nutrient production by those bacteria, the healthy bacteria in the gut. And then this short chain fatty acid production by the bacteria fermenting fiber, because our body needs short chain fatty acids, is often what gives fiber a good rap in the conventional and functional medicine communities. Now, I want to unpack this idea a little bit more in just a moment, but here are the two common myths that I often encounter around fiber. So the first one is that increasing fiber will help people poop. And this is a lot of even my IBS-C or constipation prone clients will often circle back and ask me this question, sometimes even after we've been working together for a little while, if they're still struggling with achieving a healthy, regular bowel movement, just because it's so ingrained in, culturally how we think, because the messaging is out there everywhere, like eat more fiber, eat some prunes, drink prune juice, right? Like, I'm exaggerating just a little bit, but it's the fact that it helps people poop, and then secondarily that it's necessary for the colon to be healthy. And this is coming, I would say, more so from conventional mainstream dietary advice. Even just ideas like you need to eat a high fiber diet to reduce your risk of colon cancer. And we really want to look at these two ideas and decide, okay, is there really value? Is there truth in both of these concepts? Or is there potentially some interpretation of these things that might have been misconstrued or might be misconstrued to actually promote the idea that eating a lot of fiber is a great idea across the board for everyone. So first of all, there's really no evidence that increasing your fiber in your diet is going to result in increased moisture in the stool or in the gut, which for the constipation prone people, if these are people who have tend to have a drier, harder stool, does actually matter, because part of what they're aiming to achieve is creating more moisture in the stool to help move that bowel movement along. So if fiber really doesn't bring more moisture into the intestines, is it really achieving that aim of helping them move a dry stool through the tract, right? There is some evidence that it can help to increase transit time in the gut, which can at times be helpful, again, just depending on the nature of the constipation you might be dealing with. Again, when we talk about constipation, it's a little bit of a broad spectrum. For some people, it's not that their stool is necessarily impacted dry and hard. For others, it is. For some people, it's actually that their bowels are just sluggish and aren't able to actually move the stool efficiently through the colon. So there's kind of this range when it comes to bowel movements and what we tend to refer to as constipation. So even if it does increase transit time, or it can have that effect, that doesn't necessarily translate into making bowel movements easier for someone who's struggling with sluggish bowels, depending on what else is impacting the bowels. So what I've actually found experientially in working with lots of clients on both the diarrhea and the constipation end is that typically increasing fiber in the diet will tend to make their symptoms worse. And I'll get into why I think that's true in just a moment. Let me just circle back, because I realized I forgot to touch on just what exactly are high fiber or, lots of fiber containing foods. So basically, these would be foods from the plant kingdom. So all of your fruits, your vegetables, grains, generally the foods that the plant-based diet folks would tend to tout as super, super healthy for us. And, eating a boatload of those would, create this really diverse microbiome because of all the fiber. So, these are generally, like I said, carbohydrates, plants, vegetables, fruits, and grains. So, so now that we're clear on that, let me just talk a little bit about the Weston A Price studies. This is actually something I bring up in my webinar when I do my webinar, because it's such a great, in a sense, one-of-a-kind research that was done actually quite a while ago. I think it was post-World War II. Weston A Price was a holistic dentist that at the time was very interested in the connection between dental health and holistic health of a person. And he ended up actually doing this worldwide research and travel, where he identified a number of different locations to travel to around the world. And he was really interested in looking at different native populations right at the time of the introduction of processed foods into the diet. So back at the time of pre and post World War II, there were still quite a number of native populations across the world that were still, in a sense, eating their native diet that was tied to the earth, tied to whole foods, really hadn't had a lot of infiltration of processed foods, and specifically foods that were packaged, made from refined flour products, right? And but there was kind of this cusp of that starting to happen. And so what he actually found when he traveled was that when he looked at comparatively native people that had a higher fiber diet because of where they lived, they were able to source more plant matter, incorporate that into their diet, versus a lower fiber diet. And these were generally populations that lived in more northern climates that were more dependent upon sea animals for sources of their sustenance, that didn't have, the climate to really sustain a lot of plant matter growth. He actually found no difference in their overall physical health as long as they were eating that native diet tied to the climate and the environment that they lived in, which is pretty fascinating because, again, low fiber, high fiber, it really wasn't a issue. It didn't really impact how that translated to their overall health. And from that, we know that in both cases, gut health presumably was really quite well. What he actually did find was that in locations where processed foods were being introduced, the younger generations, especially that at a younger age were having exposure to these refined flour foods, essentially got habituated to them, became addicted to them, incorporated them in larger amounts into their diet, and actually very quickly over the course of one generation, he started to observe significant degeneration in the health of that particular younger generation of people, down to the level of, their palates actually narrowing, bone structure was underdeveloped, their height and overall stature and build was actually less than the previous generation that had grown up on a whole foods native diet. Lots of different things started to change. And what's so fascinating and relevant about his work today is that it very much correlates with a lot of the degeneration we've been seeing happen in the United States, but especially the Western part of the world, for many, many decades now. And, we're kind of at this turning point, I would argue, where with our youngest part of the population, our children, we need to start to instill this knowledge of ancestral diets, of eating whole foods, of sort of essentially going back to basics the way that people used to eat, 100 years ago, in order to start to restore health. I don't want to get on that soapbox too much because it's one I can get really passionate about, but needless to say, the essence of Weston A Price's work is that he really didn't find a correlation between fiber and health of populations that he looked at. So I wanted just to put that out there and encourage you to actually do a little research on that if this is something that interests you. Are you struggling with chronic diarrhea or constipation and have been told by your doctor that there's either nothing wrong or that you're going to need to take a med for the rest of your life to control symptoms? What if there was another way, a way that empowered you to take back your health through a smart nutritional strategy and through running the right testing to identify true root causes? If you are ready to say yes to self-empowerment and to starting the journey to real improvement in your gut health, click the link to grab my free e-guide. So, the other point I wanted to make about fiber and, why I feel I've seen over the course of work with lots of clients, my own personal experience with my own gut health journey. And I think also what the research is showing is that, essentially fiber, if you think about it, it is a fermentable byproduct that the body can absorb. And so it is going to, in one way, shape, or form, make it down to the colon. It will be fermented by bacteria. I mean, I think that's just a given. The question becomes, is it becoming a food source for the quote unquote healthy species, or is it actually feeding and sustaining unhealthy pathogenic bacterial overgrowth that's happening in the gut? And my instinct on this is that when someone's got a very imbalanced gut microbiome, lots of different bacterial species overpopulating that don't lend to health, that eating a higher fiber diet will only sustain and promote the growth of those bacteria, the very bacteria that we want to try to knock down, eradicate, crowd out with better strains of bacteria. And this can be a difficult process to do, depending on what else is going on, which is why my experience has shown that really working on this from a dietary standpoint and trying to achieve better bacterial balance through dietary intervention is just so important. So I wanted to just make that point. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the main benefits of fiber as it's seen in the conventional as well as some of the functional medicine community are attributed to the fact that when bacteria ferment fiber, presumably the healthy bacteria, right, they create short-chain fatty acids, which are nutrition for the cells of the colon. And so these short-chain fatty acids actually can be taken up by the colon as energy. And we need to have adequate levels of short-chain fatty acids to sustain a healthy colonic lining. So they are important. But what a lot of people don't know about short-chain fatty acids by fiber fermentation is that this process is actually restricted to one part of the colon. And that's very interesting because if you look at things like inflammatory bowel disease or even IBS, you can actually have segments of the intestines that are inflamed throughout the small and large bowel that wouldn't necessarily benefit from production of short-chain fatty acids if that's tied to just this one kind of segmented area of the colon. And so, on some level, that's just interesting to note. Now, what we do know is that once the colonic cells take up these short-chain fatty acids, they actually convert them to ketones, which essentially is what our body can create to utilize energy if we are fat adapted versus burning carbohydrates or sugar for fuel. And so it's kind of this, evolutionary adaptive process that the body has developed where, if by chance we were not able to get carbohydrates as a source of fuel in our diet, we can literally live off the, healthy fat-based food sources, right? And create ketones from that produce energy for our brain, body, and cells to run on. And so these short chain fatty acids get converted into ketones, and the ketones then actually create the healthy mucus barrier in the colon, which is essentially like the soil in a garden, which is the bed that the healthy bacteria actually live in and sustain in. So we want to have a really healthy mucus barrier in the gut. And so interestingly, going in and out of nutritional ketosis, being more fat adapted actually seems to promote feeding the cells of the colon to the extent that ketones are being produced both between meals and also because a person is more fat adapted and is eating, a lower, potentially lower carb diet in cases where they don't have beneficial bacterial species available to ferment fiber and create these short chain fatty acids. And so kind of what's sort of theorized is that in situations where there's a significant amount of microbiome imbalance, which there almost always is in IBS and IBD, interestingly, having a more fat adapted type of diet where the person is actually mindfully producing ketones more so than say a healthy person who's got a different bacterial composition could help to promote a healthier bacterial rebalancing in the gut and reduce inflammation. I know this is a little bit of a complicated concept I'm trying to describe here, but just understand that if you've got a disrupted gut microbiome, it's highly likely that you may need to eat a more refined and controlled diet and mindfully emphasize certain food sources over others to maintain good microbial balance because of the disruptions that have been there, whenever that was created at some point in time versus a healthy person who's never had gut issues, in a sense, probably has a greater capacity to eat a range of foods without having negative changes or an impact on their microbiome. So, that's one thing I just wanted to mention. There's a couple of different practitioners I want to just cite in terms of, the research that they've sort of spoken of and the work they've done around this topic. And these are people that you might have heard of. If not, I'm going to link to a couple of different, one is going to be a YouTube video and the other will be a podcast on Spotify so that, in your own free time, you could kind of listen to this because I find it very, very fascinating. And again, these are folks out there in the functional medicine community that are actually questioning this whole, idea that fiber is great for everyone and, is it really necessary for a healthy gut? One of those people is Dr. Paul Mason. And in his podcast, which I'll link below, he cites a study of 63 people who had idiopathic constipation, meaning they didn't know what the source of the constipation was, but they were struggling with it. And they were put in these different control groups and given different levels of fiber in their diet. And of these groups, 43 people went on a zero fiber diet. And it actually turned out that resolved their constipation, which is, again, contrary to the messaging that we're often told. So, I also think this is one of the reasons why an elemental diet, which is a pre-digested zero fiber powdered drink that is given as an intervention for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth and also as a tool to put inflammatory bowel disease in remission. I believe this is why elemental diet, one of the reasons why it's so effective is that it takes fiber out of the diet during the time the person is taking it, which allows the gut to calm down, the inflammation to come down. And then, with enough time, in many cases, the symptoms will go into complete remission. So that's really fascinating to look at as well. Before closing out today's episode, I'm going to link below in the show notes to a YouTube video that features Dr. Paul Saladino talking about the topic of fiber. He's definitely coming more from the animal-based diet camp of philosophy. And so, again, is very passionate around the idea of looking at fiber as, is it really necessary to have in the diet to support good gut health or not? And so he makes some really good points and talks about some really interesting research in this short video. So I definitely recommend you check that out. The one last point I really just want to make on this whole entire topic is this. From what I've seen, diet is a very bio-individual thing. And generally, having worked with a lot of folks struggling with gut symptoms and who've been diagnosed with things like IBS or even IBD, the truth of the matter is, if you're eating a diet that contains foods that are causing an exacerbation of symptoms and just inflammation in general in the gut, that usually does not lend itself to good health. And so to say that, certain individuals have to keep trying to force fiber in as a resolution to their chronic gut issues if they don't respond well to that, in my mind and from what I've experienced, is not a very smart approach to take. The other piece to this, of course, is there can be so many root cause issues driving the inability to tolerate foods, including foods high in fiber, that an individual may be dealing with. And this is why doing a really good quality functional stool test can be helpful to identify some of these root cause factors and deal with them appropriately. Now, is it possible, if we remedy things like bad gut bugs and we improve upper digestive function, that a person can regain tolerance to high fiber foods? Absolutely. Is this true for all people struggling with symptoms of IBS and IBD? Not necessarily. And so I definitely don't think that we should try to push that, or that the goal should be to just increase to this point of having a high fiber diet to support gut health. The truth is, some people will just never be able to get there and still have good gut function and keep their symptoms minimized.
Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.